Look around. Dark skin and very pale skin. Straight black hair and red curls. Blue eyes, brown eyes almost black. A wide flat nose and a narrow one with a high bridge. People short and stocky. People tall and lean. Now here's a counterintuitive fact. If you compare the genomes of two random people from opposite ends of the planet, they'll match at about 99.9%. We are genetically almost identical, and yet visually incredibly diverse. How did that happen? The answer isn't one story, but several different ones, woven together. All modern humans descend from a common population that lived in Africa roughly 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. And the main wave of migration out across the planet began around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. In evolutionary terms, that's a blink of an eye. In that blink, we managed to settle both the equator and the Arctic Circle, humid tropics and dry highlands, and each environment made its own demands on the body. But here's the key point, the backbone of everything we're about to discuss. Not all visible differences arose for the same reason. Skin color is perhaps the cleanest, best-studied example of natural selection acting directly. It's tightly linked to levels of ultraviolet radiation. Hair and eye color, on the other hand, are a completely different, much messier story, where selection may have played a secondary role, with chance and sexual selection taking center stage. Nose shape and body build are, again, a story of climate adaptation but structured differently than skin. And on top of all this lies blind chance, genetic drift, founder effects, population bottlenecks. Let's unpack each thread of this story in order. If evolutionary biology needed one poster child, one textbook perfect example to point to and say, this is how natural selection works, it would be human skin. Here's the problem your skin has been quietly solving for 250,000 years. Melanin, the pigment that darkens your skin, has to do two jobs at once, and those two jobs fight each other. Job 1. Block ultraviolet radiation. UV light doesn't just cause sunburn. It tears apart folate in your bloodstream, a compound your body needs for cell division, for a developing fetus's nervous system, for basic male fertility. Near the equator, where the sun sits almost straight overhead every single day of the year, that's not a minor inconvenience. That's a direct hit to your ability to reproduce. Dark skin, packed with melanin, is armor against that. Job 2. Let enough UV light in to make vitamin D. Your skin manufactures vitamin D using sunlight, and vitamin D controls how you absorb calcium, how strong your bones are, how your immune system functions. Move far enough from the equator, and the sun gets weak and low in the sky for most of the year. Too much melanin up there, and you can't make enough vitamin D to keep your bones from failing. Light skin lets more of that scarce sunlight through. So you've got two life or death pressures pulling in opposite directions, and skin color is the compromise. Get too dark, too far north, and you're vulnerable to disease. Get too light, too close to the equator, and cancer and infertility come knocking. Map global UV intensity, then map the skin tones of indigenous populations around the world, and the two maps line up almost perfectly. This is one of the cleanest correlations in all of anthropology. And here's the detail that should genuinely impress you. The genes behind lighter skin are not the same genes in every population. Europeans lightened up largely through variants of two specific genes, SLC2, 4A5, and SLC4, 5A2. East Asian populations arrived at a similarly light skin tone through a partly different genetic route. Two separate populations, thousands of miles apart, facing the same problem, independently landed on the same solution using different tools. That's convergent evolution, and it's a signature of selection working hard and working fast. And fast is the key word. This didn't take hundreds of thousands of years. It likely happened over a span of just a few thousand. When the stakes are this high, when the cost of the wrong skin tone is measured in cancer and infertility, evolution moves quickly. Skin color is the story of natural selection doing exactly what it's supposed to do: fast, brutal, and precise. Now forget everything you just learned about how clean this process is, because the next chapter breaks all of it. Here's a question. If cold, Low sun environments favor lighter features the same way they favor lighter skin. Why isn't the whole planet's northern half covered in blue eyes and blonde hair? It isn't. And that's the first clue that something completely different is going on here. Hair and eye color diversity on Earth isn't spread out evenly along a gradient like skin is. It's crammed into one surprisingly small pocket of the map, mainly northern and eastern Europe. Blue eyes, green eyes, gray eyes, blonde hair, red hair, ash brown hair, all concentrated in one region, not smeared logically across every cold climate on the planet the way you'd expect if the same rules applied. And the genetics get even stranger. Blue eyes trace back, as far as scientists can tell, to a single mutation. One mutation, in one gene region called OCA2, HERC2, that appeared somewhere around the Black Sea roughly 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. Every single blue-eyed person alive today is, genetically, a descendant of that one event. Compare that to skin, which lightened independently multiple times in multiple places because it was under heavy, repeated selection pressure. Eyes lightened once, one time. Then it just spread through migration. Think about what that implies. If blue eyes gave a real survival advantage in cold climates, you'd expect it to pop up independently in Siberia, in Scandinavia, in the mountains of Patagonia, wherever humans faced similar cold. It didn't. It happened once, in one place, and that's it. So scientists went looking for a different kind of explanation, and they found two serious candidates. The first is genetic drift, and this is chance in its rawest form. Picture a small band of Ice Age hunter-gatherers isolated somewhere in Eastern Europe for generations. In a small population, the frequency of a rare gene can swing wildly for no reason at all, just because a handful of people happen to have more surviving children than others that particular decade. Flip a coin 10 times and you might get 7 heads. Flip it 10,000 times and you'll land close to 50-50. Small human populations are the 10-flip version. Random noise gets amplified instead of averaged out. A neutral trait, one with zero effect on survival, can spike in frequency purely by accident and then just stay there. The second candidate is more controversial, and it's a genuinely wild idea: sexual selection. Anthropologist Peter Frost has argued that toward the end of the last ice age, in parts of northern Europe, men were dying at significantly higher rates than women, likely from the sheer danger of ice age hunting. That would have left more women than available men. And when women are competing hard for a limited pool of partners, anything that makes you stand out becomes valuable, including something as simple as an unusual eye or hair color. If men in that environment started favoring novelty, favoring rarity, that preference alone could have driven a trait to spread fast, not because it helped anyone survive a winter, because it helped someone get chosen. To be clear, this is a hypothesis, not settled science, and researchers still argue about it. But it explains two things the clean selection did its story can't: why this trait is crammed into one small region, and why it appeared so late and so suddenly. Hair texture has a similar fog around it. There's a reasonable theory that tightly curled hair in some African populations creates an insulating air gap, shielding the scalp from direct sun while still allowing airflow to cool the head. It's plausible. But the evidence isn't nearly as tight as it is for skin. There are too many variables, too many other genetic changes tangled up in the same region, to say with confidence that heat management is the whole story. So here's the honest summary. The further you move from skin toward hair and eyes, the less this is a story about climate killing the wrong people, and the more it's a story about small, isolated groups, random luck, and quite possibly what your ancestors found attractive around a fire 10,000 years ago. Back to solid ground. Back to a trait natural selection clearly had its hands on: your nose. Beyond smell, your nose has a job most people never think about. It's climate control for your lungs. Air has to be warmed and humidified before it goes deep into your chest, or cold, dry air will damage delicate lung tissue. And the exact shape of your nasal cavity determines how well that job gets done. A narrow, tall nose with a long, winding internal passage forces air to travel further and touch more moist tissue on its way in. That's a huge advantage in cold, dry climates, which is exactly where you find this nose shape most often: Northern Europe, Central Asia, high mountain regions. A wide, short nose with a straighter, more open passage doesn't need to do nearly as much work, and it makes breathing easier when the priority isn't warming air, it's dumping heat. That's the shape you find most often in hot, humid regions like equatorial Africa. Researchers led by anthropologist Arslan Zaidi tested this directly in 2017, statistically linking nostril width to local temperature and humidity across hundreds of people of different ancestries. The pattern held up: colder, drier climate, narrower nostrils. On average, across a large sample, that's a real, measurable relationship. One honest caveat here: the nose isn't a single dial controlled by a single input. Overall, face width, cheekbone structure, and cartilage genetics all play a role too, and those parts are far less studied than the genes behind skin color. But the climate signal is strong enough and consistent enough that the nose earns its place right next to skin as a trait where natural selection left an unmistakable fingerprint. Now let's talk about your entire body, not just your face, because the same climate logic that shaped your nose shaped your build. Two rules, originally worked out for animals, apply here with almost eerie precision. Bergmann's rule says this: in cold climates, a bigger, bulkier body wins, because a larger body holds more volume relative to its surface area, and volume is where heat gets generated, while surface area is where it escapes. More volume, less relative surface, less heat lost. A compact body works like a thermos. Allen's rule adds the second half. In cold climates, shorter limbs and smaller protruding body parts, ears, nose, hands, feet, win too, because those are exactly the parts of you that bleed heat fastest into the air. In hot climates, it flips completely. Long limbs and a lean frame increase your surface area relative to your volume, turning your body into something closer to a radiator, built to shed heat as fast as possible. You can see both rules play out in the real world with almost textbook clarity. Inuit populations in the Arctic tend to be more compact, with shorter limbs, an ideal shape for holding onto heat in brutal cold. The Dinka and the Maasai of East Africa are some of the tallest people on Earth, with extraordinarily long limbs and lean builds, built to dump heat under a relentless equatorial sun. This isn't stereotype. This is a measurable, repeatable pattern, and you can find the same rule in animal species from bears to foxes. The colder the range, the bulkier and more compact the average body. Height needs one more layer of caution though, because it's not purely a climate story. Nutrition and childhood disease play an enormous role, sometimes a bigger role than climate ever could. If a growing body has to spend its limited resources fighting off illness and malnutrition instead of building bone and muscle, adult height drops, regardless of what the genes say. Look at North and South Korea. Genetically, this is essentially one population split apart just a few decades ago. But the difference in nutrition on either side of that border has produced a real, measurable gap in average adult height. That's not evolution. That's proof of how flexible height actually is, shaped as much by what happens during childhood as by anything written in your DNA. There's one more piece of this puzzle that's still genuinely unresolved. Certain populations in the tropical rainforests of Central Africa and Southeast Asia, sometimes called pygmy populations, are notably short, and scientists have proposed several competing explanations. Energy conservation in an environment where food is chronically scarce, earlier reproduction as a response to shorter life expectancy in a harsh environment, better heat dissipation, and easier movement through dense forest, where a large body is simply a liability. Nobody has nailed down which factor matters most, and honestly, that's fine. Not every human trait comes with a tidy, single answer. Here's something worth sitting with for a second. Not everything about your appearance happened because it was useful. A huge chunk of human genetic variation has nothing to do with benefit or harm. It's neutral, and its fate got decided by nothing more than blind chance. Picture a small group, a few dozen people, breaking off from a larger population to settle somewhere new, an island. an isolated valley, the far edge of a continent. The genes that group carries with them are just a random sample pulled from the larger population's full range of diversity, and small random samples are almost never a perfect miniature of the whole. Some rare variants get left behind entirely. Others, purely by chance, end up wildly overrepresented. That's called the founder effect, and it explains why isolated island or mountain populations so often carry one distinctive trait that's rare or non-existent almost everywhere else on Earth. There's a bigger, more dramatic version of the same idea, the population bottleneck. A catastrophe, an epidemic, a brutal migration through hostile terrain, anything that crushes a population down to a tiny fraction of its former size. Whatever genetic diversity survives that crash is all that gets passed on. Some researchers even connect this to the human migration out of Africa itself, pointing to the massive eruption of the Toba supervolcano roughly 74,000 years ago as a possible trigger for a dramatic population crash, though that theory is still debated. Here's the part that should stick with you. Genetic drift does not ask whether a trait is good or bad for survival. It's a lottery. And the smaller the population, the more that lottery can swing wildly, dragging traits with zero connection to fitness up or down in frequency purely by accident. A meaningful slice of the variation you see in hair and eye color almost certainly got here this way. There's one more force running underneath this entire story, and it's the strangest one: sexual selection. Selection driven not by the environment, but by who your ancestors chose to have children with. Natural selection, in the classic sense, punishes bad traits with disease or death. Sexual selection works differently and, honestly, more capriciously. A trait can spread simply because somebody found it attractive, with zero connection to whether it actually helped anyone survive. You already saw a likely example of this back in Chapter 2, with eye color in Ice Age Europe. But there's a much better documented version of this same principle, one that shows exactly how culture can rewrite a gene pool: lactose tolerance. The ability of an adult to digest milk without discomfort is a genetic mutation that was essentially pointless before humans domesticated cattle and started drinking milk well into adulthood. The moment herding became part of daily life for populations in parts of Europe and East Africa, that mutation suddenly became a serious advantage, an extra reliable source of calories and hydration, and it spread through those populations at a speed that's almost shocking by evolutionary standards. That's a textbook case of a cultural shift creating brand new pressure on human genes. Appearance likely worked on a version of the same principle. Cultural standards of attractiveness function as their own kind of environment, a social one instead of a climatic one. And where a certain look gets consistently favored generation after generation inside a reasonably closed population, it can absolutely become genetically fixed, purely because the people who had it kept finding partners and having children. Now put it all together. If you lined up every trait covered so far on a spectrum, from explained almost entirely by direct selection to explained almost entirely by chance, here's roughly where everything lands. On one end, skin color, and to a large extent, nose shape and overall body proportions. The connection to environment here is so tight, you can nearly predict a population's typical skin tone or nose shape just from latitude, humidity, and sun intensity alone. These traits carried a direct, brutal cost when they got it wrong: skin cancer, folate deficiency, vitamin D failure, damaged lungs, uncontrolled heat loss. Selection moved on these traits hard, fast, and in some cases convergently, arriving at the same solution through different genetic routes in different corners of the world. On the other end, hair color and eye color. Here, the link to survival is either extremely weak or hasn't been found at all. What's visible instead is the fingerprint of completely different forces. A single mutation, born in one place, at one moment. Small, isolated Ice Age populations where chance alone could send a trait's frequency swinging wildly. And quite possibly, sexual selection, mate choices that rewarded novelty and rarity with zero connection to survival advantage. Height and body build sit somewhere in the middle. Real climate adaptation via Bergmann's and Allen's rules, layered with a massive influence from childhood nutrition, layered with its own dose of local chance. And running underneath every single one of these traits, even the ones under heavy selection, is a constant undertow of pure randomness. Genetic drift, founder effects, population bottlenecks, adding noise and local quirks to the whole picture. This isn't one clean story. It's several stories running in parallel. The ruthless logic of survival, where the cost of failure was immediate and severe. The blind lottery, where the cost of failure was low enough for chance to take over. And the strange, unpredictable logic of sexual selection, where nature wasn't making the call, your ancestors were. Back to where we started. 99.9% of your genome is identical to every other human being on the planet. That remaining fraction of a percent, the part that's different, didn't spread out evenly. It's split into several overlapping stories, each running on its own logic, its own timeline, its own dose of chance. Your skin tells the story of a direct standoff with the sun. Your nose tells the story of learning to breathe air that could have destroyed your lungs. Your body tells the story of holding heat in or throwing it off, depending on where you had to survive. And your hair and eyes tell a quieter story, one about tiny, isolated bands of ancestors, about a random mutation that happened to land in the right place at exactly the right moment, and possibly about what someone found beautiful around a fire thousands of years before writing existed. None of this is chaos. None of this is random noise with no pattern at all. It's a map, written directly into your genome, of every migration, every climate, and every stroke of pure luck your ancestors lived through over the last several tens of thousands of years. And the closer you look, the clearer one thing becomes. Underneath all of that variety is the exact same story, told over and over again in different climates, by the same species, figuring out, one impossible environment at a time, how to survive.